So, as I should, I'm going to open us up in the Old Testament. Isaiah 46, 9 through 11. When Chad Lyman was speaking with us a couple Wednesday nights ago, he read the first part of this, and it got me thinking about prophecy in kind of a new way. It says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from the ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure, calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executes my counsel from a far country. Yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it." You know, when I think of prophecy, kind of think of people looking at things, at the idea of things that are going to happen, not necessarily a power behind it making these things occur. And but God says, when I tell you things, then I am setting things into motion. We're going to go to Matthew 1, 1 and 2. Somebody would read that.
The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers.
We open up in Matthew with this genealogy of Jesus, and this is important because several times God has prophesied that through this line that Jesus would come, that the Messiah would come. If someone would get 1 Chronicles 17, 1 through 4.
One through 4.
Yes.
Now it came to pass when David was dwelling in his house that David said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in the house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under tent curtains." Then Nathan said to David, "Do all that is in your heart, for God is with you." But it happened that night that the word of God came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, you shall not build for me a house to dwell in."
Through 17.
I'm sorry. What else was to read again?
1 through 17. Or,
One.
sorry.
I'm sorry. Can you need to pause now?
1 through 14. Sorry. 14.
1 through 14?
Yes.
I'm not reading all that. Somebody's next.
Did you read through 4?
I read through 4, yep.
Okay. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their leaders, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone and have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men of the earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel and plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. I declare to you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will take my love away from him, as I took it away from my predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever.
He shall build a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And I will not take my mercy away from him, as I took it from him that was before thee. God promises David that his throne will continue on, and that he will establish his kingdom through the line of David. If someone will get 2 Chronicles 21, 6 through 7, and then someone else Isaiah 37, 35.
6 through 7?
21, 6 through 7.
I can do that too. Alright. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as did the house of Ahab, for he had the daughter of Ahab to wife, and he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah. Howbeit Jehovah would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David, and as he promised to give a lamp to him and to his children always.
And Isaiah 37, 35.
For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David.
So, as we go through the history of the kingdom of Judah and Israel, we see that God is steering history, although he could have and would have, other than his promise, destroyed the children of Israel. He kept that promise and kept that line going so that his prophecies could be fulfilled. And then Jeremiah 23, 4 through 6. And I will set up shepherds over them which shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed. Neither shall they be lacking, saith the Lord. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise up unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name, whereby he shall be called, the Lord our righteousness. And God keeps promising and keeps prophesying that this future Savior will come through the line of David. Then will somebody get Genesis 22, 15 through 18?
And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.
Again, we see that now God is promising that all the nations will be blessed through the seed of Abraham, as we saw back in Matthew. And then will someone get Galatians 3, 14 through 16?
So that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ.
Paul references back to this and points out that the seed of Abraham that was promised is Christ. That's about all I had prepared.
Perfect.
Hand that back to you.
That's all I've got to say about that.
I appreciate it, especially since I didn't help you out there beforehand. We get this set up with all of our new classes this morning. I forgot to come ahead and be prepared. If you're still in Galatians, turn over maybe a page or scroll down or go over to chapter 4. And I know I've read this before. Galatians 4, starting in verse 4, says, But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So kind of closing this discussion, that he's going to be talking about the fulfillment of prophecy that comes in Jesus.
He's saying that here is a specific time that God chose, and when we look at the culture of the first century, when we look at the situation, we look at what has happened throughout the centuries to bring them to this point, saying this was the time, and God said now is the right time. So when we open up the New Testament, that's why it is important for us to understand about the culture, and the background, some information about all those people, because it really comes into play. God says, I'm going to do all these things. Throughout the entire Old Testament, He's looking forward and says, this is what's going to occur, right? They are looking for David's kingdom to be established forever, right? They are looking forward to this. And then when it comes to, the first century, God says, this is the perfect time. Let's go, right? And so there's a very specific circumstance that we read about here. So, kind of reviewing, since we weren't here last week, I had a guest speaker, and that was cool. So let's just kind of recover. I don't have any extra handouts. Next week we'll be on a different one, but we have inspiration and proofs is what we're talking about right here. Just talking about the idea of biblical inspiration. And then a couple weeks ago we talked about some different Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled in the Old Testament. And obviously right here we've been talking about New Testament prophecies that are fulfilled, or more specifically, there we go, not like the ocean, right? Just thinking about I'm sorry. Great fantasy football joke right here. So anyway, we took the Wonderlic to determine draft order, and I got first.
Well, we all took the Wonderlic.
I took it, and I screenshotted it, so you have a timestamp on it. I'm just saying, Alvin Kamara.
He just happens to be the commissioner of the league, and he just happened to get the highest score.
Hey.
Pacific.
Anyway, so back to this. We talked about some things that were prophesied in the Old Testament, were foretold. We talked about like Tyre and Cyrus and different things about prophecies in the Old Testament. And then now in the New Testament, you have these messianic prophecies that are going to be prophesied, hundreds or even thousands of years before it actually occurs. So if we can just do a little bit of bouncing back and forth, let's look at this. Who can get Genesis 3:15?
I got it.
Who can get Genesis 12 verses 3 and 7? And then who can get Genesis 49:10?
I'll do it.
Alrighty. First off, Genesis 3 verse 15.
I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And she shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
So, what is being talked about here? You have the serpent, the devil, who has tempted Eve and Adam, and they have sinned. They're falling away, and so now God has said from the very beginning, from the moment that they're going to have to leave the garden, He said there's going to be a time to come. There's going to come a moment where your power is going to be broken, right? And so the idea by you shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel is, you have a serpent, right? And so, I don't know how Kyle killed that rattlesnake yesterday. We talked about that a minute ago. I don't know. Any of y'all else saw it? I heard that this morning. Was that?
It appeared to be missing a head.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it, But anyway, so the idea is you have a snake, and you stomp down on this snake so completely that you kill it. You bash its head in, but in doing so, you've hurt your heel because of how utterly you have destroyed it, right? And so that would be Jesus on the cross, right? That there was suffering involved in relinquishing us from the power of sin, right? What Paul talks about in Romans, right? So that's basically what we're talking about here. I have the wrong reference in here. If you have one of the things, the reference here actually, Matthew 1:23 actually refers to Isaiah 7:12, And it's a quote. It says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. So that's a different prophecy right there. Those two don't necessarily correlate, but that is another prophecy you have, Isaiah 7:12. You're going to have this prophecy made. That's rather specific, right? That's hard to pull off. That's a very difficult prophecy to pull off. So the fact that Jesus meets those qualities, once you start stacking all of these up, it's very difficult to find a way to say that this didn't actually occur, right? Genesis 12 verses 3 and 7. I just have 3 and 7.
Okay. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him.
That's the verse that we just read, Galatians 3:16. Paul goes back and talks about that fulfillment. Through your offspring, the whole world will be blessed, right? And Paul is writing this letter to the Galatians. Probably a very early letter. I think it's written very, very early in the history of the church. And he's saying to them, he's like, this happened, and we've seen it, And as the spread of the gospel continues, it kind of reinforces the point, right? That the entire world will be blessed through Jesus, right? As it continues, it's not something that just kind of fizzled out, right? Christianity did not fizzle out, I don't think. I think that's kind of safe to say. So that's what you have there, fulfillment. Paul's going to point to in Galatians 3. And then who has Genesis 49, verse 10?
The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people.
And so the scepter shall not depart from the feet of Judah, right? How Matthew starts off his gospel, and we just read that. You have David, the son of Abraham, and then he's going to talk about verse 2 at the end of it, Jacob, the father of Judah, and his brothers, right? And the line goes through Judah. So all these prophecies that have taken place to be like this specific person, over time, this has had to happen. And so if you have these prophecies all the way back in Genesis saying, okay, he is going to be the father at some point of the Savior, of the Messiah. And then you have later on down the line, you say this individual here, right? And it's just going to kind of continue on. Turn over to, somebody get Micah chapter 5, verse 2.
But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, thou, though it be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been of old, from everlasting.
And if we turn over to Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 1, says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee to the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn." So, we have other prophecies that talk about he shall be called a Nazarene, right? Well, that's always been a point of contention. How can somebody be considered a Nazarene but also be born in the city of David, which is Bethlehem, right? How does that work? Well, he was born in the city of Bethlehem. That happened at the right time, and then he lived in the city of Nazareth, right? Our kids were born in 3 different states, right? But they live here. It's one of those things. So when Hannah talked about where she grew up, she's probably going to say she grew up in Huntsville, because it's easier than saying Gurley and having people say, "Where is that?" So she's gonna tell people she grew up in Huntsville, right? But was she born in Huntsville? No, she was born in St. Mary's, Georgia, right? Same kind of thing, but you have all these different pieces that really have to fall into place what would have caused Joseph and Mary to go to Bethlehem just to have the baby? No, they didn't do that, right? That makes no sense. You don't take somebody who is very pregnant, about to pop. You don't take them to another city, right? That doesn't make any sense. You stay close to home. Well, I mean, this is done because, that was a royal decree, and you kind of had to do it. There was no options right there. So then let's skip over that one. Somebody get Psalm chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. Who's got that one?
I got it.
Thank you.
For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore.
So you shall not abandon my soul to Sheol. Turn over to Matthew 28. There's a lot of different places we could look at, but this is a real short one. Matthew 28, verses 8 through 10. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, Greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And then Jesus said, Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. So, as we sing the song, the tomb was found empty, right? Jesus rose. You already have this thing where Jesus is going to die. There's prophecies about that, but that he's not going to stay dead. Once you start compounding, and we could go on, there's some people have number a little over 300 or so messianic prophecies. Once you start adding all of these up, the likelihood of it just happening, right, doesn't seem to make any sense. And now, it would be one thing if all we had was the Bible's word for it, right? The Bible is obviously trying to prove a point. John makes no bones about it. John says, the exact quote is somebody, if I don't believe all the books in the world can contain the deeds of Jesus if they were to be written down, and he says, but these have been written in order that you might believe, and believing have life eternal in his name, right? That's his point, saying the reason I have written these things is because I want you to believe. So a skeptic might say, well, the Bible is trying to get me to believe something, so why should I believe it like that? Well, we have all these other pieces of evidence that come up, such as we know who was governor when Jesus was killed. We have a thing called the Pilate inscription that says that he was over this area during these years, and so we have all these historical markers. We have a historical marker that tells us, hey, this is when the census took place that caused Joseph and Mary to have to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem, and this lines up perfectly with when Jesus would have been alive, right? Or when he would have been born in order for him to die under Pilate. We have all these different pieces of information. One of the best we have great evidence of. Turn over to Acts chapter 18. Moving on a little bit from Jesus here. Acts chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So what we have here is the Edict of Claudius, is what it's called. And we have all this great historical information about this, that we can pinpoint the year where Claudius said, okay, the Jews are the cause of all the problems that we're having, and they send them from Rome. This is kind of the time where people start realizing, Christians aren't Jews, right? Because up to this point, you're like, okay, well, you got your Pharisees, your Sadducees, your Essenes, your Christians, and they're like, oh, they're just another piece of Judaism. And it's like, oh, okay, so Christians aren't all Jews. There's plenty of people who are Gentiles who are also Christians. Okay, this is a different thing, right? But we can find this and pinpoint this. In fact, all of the places where we have a historical piece that Luke writes, well, really everyone, but Luke is kind of specific because we have almost 50 different pieces, names and places that he gives us. Anywhere we can find any historical data it matches perfectly with what Luke recorded. And it goes back to what we talked about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago here, where Luke opens up his gospel by saying, I've set about to write an orderly account of the things which occurred, right? So he's going. He provides the references. You know, you write something for somebody else is one thing. You write something and you're like, I want somebody else to be able to come in and double check my work. You might start adding in a little bit of references and things like that. That's what Luke is doing here. So you not only do you have all of these messianic prophecies that are fulfilled, but they're supported by other historical sources. And everything else that we read in the New Testament, which we have a lot more, just naturally, we have a lot more sources for what happened during the time of the New Testament than we do for the Old Testament. 1,500 years difference there, right? Things do get destroyed and everything, so it makes a lot more sense that we have a lot more historical data. And also during this time, you have people who are actually interested in being historians, rather than necessarily just as much pumping up your side, like I've said before about the Egyptians. People say, well, the Exodus couldn't have happened because the Egyptians never record such a loss. Well, if we go by every time the Egyptians record a loss, they're still the most powerful kingdom in the world today, right? But is that the case? No. They never talk about anything bad that happened, You can't, think about it, you're gonna put all your history up on a block of stone for everyone to see, probably only putting out the good things, State, what?
The highlights.
The highlights, right. State Run's not gonna be like, yeah, well, things weren't so great,
You don't want to hear about the when the quarterback busted his knee in third quarter. Let's just talk about we won the game.
Yeah.
History books are written by the winners, not the losers.
What?
History books are written by the winners, not the losers.
That's true. That's true.
Did Georgia State have something to write about yesterday?
And y'all had something right about last year.
Too soon, Tim.
That's the thing. I can still talk trash to Auburn fans because our team that lost to Georgia State still went to Auburn and whooped y'all. So
I want to go back to what you said. You brought up Psalm 16. That's not a messianic prophecy, though.
well, it's referring back to David, and you're also going to get New Testament writers. I don't have the reference on me, but refer back to that.
New Testament writers refer back to Psalm 16.
Yeah, I don't have that reference on me.
Next week.
Okay, yeah, we'll bring that up next week. Anyway, so there's some evidence. Where am I? Okay, but all of these historical sources that we have, the Pilate inscription. There's another piece here. There's a term people use for quite some time to try to destroy the credibility of the Bible, especially Luke. So you have Acts chapter 17. Paul and his missionary group, they end up in Thessalonica, right? And they get brought in front of, and the Bible calls them polytarchs, right? It's the only time we find this word. The polytarchs, you're like, what is that? Okay, you have council members, you have all these different kinds of structures, judges, in different places you have different words and stuff like that, and they say, okay, well, where did the term polytarchs go to? Well, they said, well, Luke must have made a mistake because he's talking about an office that doesn't exist, right? If someone's going to talk about a political office that did not exist in our government, wouldn't we be like, hold up. He's the secretary of the what? And that's kind of what we're talking about right here. But then in 1960, they found a list of 32, which was the members of the polytarchs, right? Who these individuals are. So you go for all this time and saying, well, since we haven't found evidence. The evidence of absence is not, or the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? To say that, well, we haven't found another proof of this means that it can't be true. Well, that's not exactly true because, as we brought up a few times before, the Hittites did exist. They're just buried underneath 16 feet of sand. And so when you have these individuals called polytarchs, and you go, well, that doesn't make any sense. You don't have them anywhere else. Well, guess what? Thessalonica was actually a very special city that had a very special status in the Roman Empire, which is the reason why Paul and his missionary, his fellow missionaries, when they get pulled up in front of the Polytarchs, the accusation is they have taught us to worship gods that are not lawful, or asked us to do things that are not lawful for Romans to do, because they had a very special status as a city, and you didn't want to mess with the Roman government. So if you have special tax exemptions, for example, very, very good tax breaks for being in Thessalonica, and then people are like, oh, well, let's do something that the Romans wouldn't like. Well, the Romans don't even have to come in there and destroy you to stop it. They just have to pull your tax breaks, right? So these city leaders are like, we're not doing that. We're not going to let that happen, right? So that's the reason that they get brought up there. So they were a very special situation, and so when Luke talks about them with this very specific word that's a little bit peculiar, well, it actually makes sense once you find the evidence for it and once you think about it. Well, it makes sense that these cities would be set up differently. Rome set them up differently, right, than they set up anybody else. So there are further ones. Bring this. Also, you have the number of times that the emperors are mentioned in the New Testament, and there was a historian called Suetonius who wrote the 12 Caesars. He wrote a history of all these Caesars, and all of these pieces, these dates overlap perfectly with the biblical record. It's one of those things that really has just the kind of ring of authenticity where you're not going to have somebody come up and say, well, this isn't true, right? A lot of people, well after the events of the Bible, have tried to say, well, this couldn't be true. But one of the biggest marks of authenticity is how the people who were in this audience, who were the first audience, received it, right? Because if someone was going to write us a letter and tell us about incredible events, especially as incredible as what we have in the New Testament, and it was just full of errors, and it had a whole bunch of things that just didn't make sense, and none of it really matched what we knew to be true, would we believe it? Would we then give up all of our previously held beliefs and say that, okay, well, now I'm going to follow this, right? And it's not just a few people, right? It's not like some kind of cult thing where you can get some people, right? But you have thousands and thousands of people following after this. Well, you have to consider that maybe, just maybe, not all of them were idiots, right? There is definitely a bias as you look back in history where you're like, well, I'm smarter than them, Okay, yeah, probably in some ways, yeah. You look back and you're like, well, I'm way smarter than them. They were probably just so dumb that that's the reason they believed it, right? Well, I find it very hard to reconcile that with what we actually see. Luke was clearly not an idiot, right? He was able to put together this record, and he was able to go through and be able to compile the events that happened in a readable way, in a way that can be presented, and 2,000 years from now still stands up. That guy's not an idiot, right? So what is the explanation if they were all wrong, right? What's the explanation? Now, alternatively, what's the explanation for all of it being right and being cohesive, right? What other explanation can you get for the fact that you have some 40 plus authors that wrote on 3 different continents and 3 different languages over the course of 1,600 years, and all of them agree? I mean, what are the odds of that, right? I mean, you get one book and written by one author, right? And you can find errors in it. Oops, they made a mistake. We get it, right? But when you look at the Bible and you say, people have been trying to find the mistakes in this for 2,000 years, and nothing has stood. Everything that has been leveled against it, saying, this is a mistake, this is wrong, has fallen by the wayside. So how do you reconcile that? So we're talking about the concept of inspiration. Well, if we say, God inspired it, as the Bible claims for itself, that these words are God breathed, God guided the pen, however that looked, that's probably the most plausible explanation. How do you get anywhere else in the Word of Scripture right here?
Without the New Testament, it's not just cohesive. Some of this prophecy, when you start laying out the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah, it's just kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you put in the New Testament fulfillment, this all makes sense. And it had to have been steered by God.
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't have just been known. It was prepared.
Exactly. These events were laid in. And Paul says in his sermon on Mars Hill, Acts 17:30, I believe, it says, basically that everyone has been, no, a little bit before that. He says that everybody's kind of been put into a specific place in order that they might reach out, grope for, and lay hold of the truth, right? So there's a lot behind that, but you think about throughout history that God has placed people where they are in order that He might bring about the truth. Think about Moses, right? And everything Moses had to go through. He didn't get to live with his family growing up. He got taken. He was put in the castle or in the palace, and he is educated to the top level of what the Egyptians could possibly educate someone to back then, which was pretty good, actually. They were very smart people. And then he goes and he spends 40 years out in the wilderness, being a survivalist essentially, right? Taking care of sheep. And then he goes and he brings the children of Israel out of Egypt and leads them close to the promised land. They decide not to go in, right? But he's gonna lead them out of there. So all these things that had to be prepared in order to do this. And then on the other side, you have the Pharaoh, right? Did the Pharaoh have the opportunity to glorify God? Did the Pharaoh have the opportunity to see the truth? Well, yes, quite a bit, right? I mean, once you get to 7, right, where you have fire and hail falling from the sky, I would have called it quits way earlier than that, but, at that point, I'm like, okay, we're done. We're really done at this point, right? He had the opportunity, right? But he decided that he wasn't going to follow God. He wasn't going to obey what God had to say. And we have all these examples in the Bible where people who had the opportunity decided not to do it. People who had the opportunity decided to follow God, right? And so when you think about all these events that come to take place, I think some people will say that God's foreknowledge of a situation, constitutes that He caused it to happen. Well, just because I know what's going to happen doesn't mean I caused it. I mean, I've looked at my kids plenty of times and been like, I know exactly what's about to happen right here, I don't have any kind of special knowledge, but I'm like, I know exactly what you are about to do right now, Did I make them do it? No. They made that decision on their own, But they're the ones that decided, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. Well, but what would have happened if God had, if Pharaoh had decided to obey God? Probably, in all likelihood, even more people would have ended up, at least in Egypt, right? Following after God and looking at Him as the one true God. Children of Israel would have gone, they would have been able to do the same thing. So God has been able to put all these people into the proper place and allow them to make the decisions. God knows what decisions are going to be made, yes, but allow them to make their decision to cause these things to happen down the road, And He's calling these events that are going to happen so far down into the road. We've kind of gone over the New Testament claims of inspiration. So in the last couple of minutes, let me just open up the floor. Any thoughts or comments here?
The reference to Psalm 16 in the New Testament as a messianic prophecy is in this Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. And
There you
Acts
go.
2.
There you
And
go.
he does
Thank
say that David was speaking about Jesus when he said that.
There you go. Yeah, I knew it was in there. I just knew I had
You're welcome.
a thank you. Yeah.
Just another connection that someone's made for me in the past in Genesis 3, when it's talking about her offspring versus your offspring, talking about the devil. In John 8, Jesus calls the Jews. He says, "Your father, the devil. If your father was God, you would have believed this, but your father is the devil." So it's just a connection to Satan's offspring.
Yeah, and
Jews that didn't believe him.
and of course that's another aspect of choice, right? You know, that's make that choice, right? God has set it up where He can be all of our fathers, but if we reject Him, you know, maybe you hold out a hand and you don't take it, then that's a choice you've made. Next week we are going to go into if y'all would agree that we've done enough in terms of the inspiration, talking about what it means, what the word inspiration means, and proof for it. You know, then we'll go into the canonization aspect, which is, so we have 66 books, right? How did we get those books? You know, why these books? Why not other books? You know, what was the criteria? What was the process? How did all of this occur? And we'll get into that, if that sounds good.
Maccabees.
All right.